We are ready.
Madam Chair, we're ready to begin when you are.
Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to the Water Policy and Legislation Committee and special meeting of the Board of Directors for West Basin Peninsula Water District. I will call this committee meeting to order. Do we have a quorum?
Director Gray, I'll read through roll call. Director Don Deere.
Here.
Chairwoman Gloria Gray.
Here.
Director Scott Houston. Director Desi Alvarez. Director Harold Williams.
Here. On the phone?
I'm sorry, what's that?
Thank
Is
you.
Houston here on the phone?
He is not currently on. Madam Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you. Item 3 is public comment. Is there any comments from the public?
Madam Chair, we have not received any requests for public comment today, although this meeting is being held both in person and virtually. So if there's any virtual attendees that would like to make public comment, please let us know by raising your virtual hand. Madam Chair, I don't see any requests for public comment.
Thank you. Item 4, presentations. Any presentations?
Staff has no presentations for today.
Okay, thank you. Item 5 is our action calendar. Would you please go through the action calendar items, Mr. Caldwell?
Yes, Madam Chair. The first item that we have for you is item 5A on the action calendar. It's Assembly Bill 1572 by Assemblywoman Friedman. And this item is related to potable water and non-functional turf. And for this presentation, we have Matt Bay, our Manager of Water Policy and Resources Development.
Thank you, EJ. Good morning. So we'll move forward to page 20 of the agenda packet. And then I'll actually go ahead and begin with the second slide in the presentation, which is page 21. So this first item today is Assembly Bill 1572, as EJ said, by Assemblymember Laura Friedman. It relates to potable water and non-functional turf. Just to give you some background on it, staff will be asking this committee to, we'll be recommending a support position on this legislation. But just for some background, in the last few years, the state of Nevada passed legislation that would ban all non-functional turf in southern Nevada by the end of 2026. This is something that California has been very aware of. They started having kind of real conversations about it last year when they started thinking about legislation. This year, they actually did introduce some legislation on this. And in addition, here in California, the State Water Board has currently prohibited the irrigation of what they call decorative grass on public medians. That's in place until December of 2023. Additionally, there's a ban on the irrigation of decorative grass on CII properties and HOA common areas, and the State Water Board is seeking to extend that ban also until the end of this year. In addition, last year, and the bullet point here is wrong. There's a typo, but it should be October of 2022. The Metropolitan Board adopted a resolution strongly urging local ordinances from their municipalities, from their water districts that would prohibit the installation and irrigation of non-functional turf, also at CII and HOAs. And then finally, the governor's water supply strategy, which was released last year, states that California will partner with local agencies to convert 500 million square feet of ornamental turf. Again, ornamental, decorative, non-functional turf, they're all kind of interchangeable by 2030. So just to go into the bill real quick, it does a few things. The first thing here is that it defines functional turf and non-functional turf. They want to make it a uniform definition so that water agencies and cities aren't confused about what applies, what doesn't apply. So functional turf, they are defining as ground cover surface of turf located in a recreational use area or community space, ball fields, places where people meet for events, those types of scenarios or locations. Turf that's enclosed by fencing or other barriers to prevent human access is not considered functional turf. In addition, non-functional turf would be any turf that isn't considered functional turf, and it includes turf that's located within street rights of way as well as parking lots, as a couple of examples. Moving to the next page. And just so this committee is aware, last week there was a big kind of movement in the bill where a big part of the bill was amended out. And this relates to multifamily residential properties. It had been included, and that was a real sticking point for cities and for water agencies. That's something that they wanted removed from the bill. And it looks like that's going to happen. The author has indicated they're going to do that for the next version of the bill. I don't know if it's officially happened yet, but it's very clear that that's going to happen. And so some of the things that I'm going to talk about here reference multifamily properties. This went to print before that action happened. So just so you're aware of that. So this bill would prohibit the use of potable water for irrigation of non-functional turf at CII properties. It would no longer apply to multifamily residential properties. It would happen by the following dates. So in 2027, it would be all properties that are kind of owned or leased by the state. In 2028, it would be all properties that are owned by public agencies and public water systems. So for us, that would be West Basin. If we had any non-functional turf at any of our properties, we would have to get rid of it or stop watering it with drinking water by that time. And then in 2029, all CII and any municipal public agencies and any remaining institutional properties with non-functional turf. Again, the rest of this no longer applies because it does reference multifamily properties. Moving to the next slide, just some other things that I wanted to call out. So it doesn't prohibit the use of potable water when it comes to ensuring tree health or to address health and safety needs. It does not prohibit the use of recycled water for the irrigation of non-functional turf. So those properties that we have that we provide recycled water to, if it is non-functional turf, we still would be able to provide that recycled water for those purposes. It also requires public water systems to adopt the same non-functional turf bans within their ordinances and regulations by January of 2027. It also requires the CII property owners of certain sizes, so above a certain square footage, they would have to certify compliance every 3 years, starting in 2030. And then it also, integrated regional water management plans would be required in the future to consider disadvantaged communities and affordable housing as it relates to non-functional turf. How can we fund the cost of redoing some of these landscapes to make them more drought tolerant in the future? Moving to the next slide. So these are some of the amendments that have been made to the bill to date. Again, originally this bill was opposed pretty widely by cities and water agencies. So they delayed some of the implementation timelines, which I just went through. They added the tree health and safety provisions to the bill. They removed the requirement that local agencies have to report on some of these things, that they have to perform compliance audits. That was a sticking point for many opposed to the bill. They removed all public utility commission requirements from the bill. They added HOA common areas as being applicable to the ban on the non-functional turf. They added the definitions of functional turf and non-functional turf. And then again, they added the new requirement for the IRWM plans to consider how to replace non-functional turf in affordable housing areas. And then finally, the last one on here is the requirement for DWR to analyze the impact on the Delta. That was removed. That was actually something that our acting general manager, E.J. Caldwell, had asked to be removed. Initially, they didn't, but then in a later version of the bill, they did remove that provision. Going to the next slide. These are just some of the positions that have been taken on AB 1572. Metropolitan Water District had a support if amended position previously. Their board also gave authority to the general manager to move to a co-sponsor position if all of the requested amendments were made to the bill. With that now happening last week, there was a letter that was sent out by their general manager saying that Metropolitan would in fact be moving to a co-sponsor position on this legislation. In addition, there was a number of water coalitions that were actively involved on this bill, Aqua, CMUA, League of California Cities. They had been on an opposed unless amended position originally. And they moved to a neutral if amended position in the last couple of weeks. And now with the multifamily aspects of the bill being removed, they are now just kind of at a true neutral position. And then CalWEP, which we do have a staff member who's on that board, they also took a support position. So how does it kind of connect to some of our grass removal programs? Again, this is a topic and an issue that we've been very involved in for the last couple of years. We've been involved with working groups at Aqua, with Metropolitan Water District. But this is really a new kind of area of opportunity for our state to target this type of non-functional turf that we haven't done so in the past. And as you know, we have our grass replacement program. We do have a CII kind of aspect to that, where we try to work with our commercial properties, with our public agency properties. You'll hear about this next week at the PI committee, how successful that effort has been the last few years. And so our grass removal program doesn't differentiate between functional turf or non-functional turf right now. But we do know that there's kind of a significant amount of non-functional turf that exists at these commercial properties who just have, kind of grass in front of their properties, kind of as a form over function type of use for that grass. And so we have applied for state grant funding in the past to kind of implement non-functional turf programs. We are going to continue to make that a priority going forward. And we're kind of looking at our programs to see how we can continue to do that. There's also been initial aerial mapping that's been done to identify and label functional and non-functional turf in the metropolitan region. But there does need to be more work that needs to be done. And that's also something that we're looking at. So moving to the last slide here. So this is our recommendation. So AB 1572 would help expedite the transition from non-functional turf in our state to more sustainable landscapes. This is something obviously that West Basin has supported through their rebate programs. It would also provide kind of the regulatory backstop and the potential financial support through the IRWM process, and then all through DWR grants to drive an increase in the removal of non-functional turf from CII properties. And so based on kind of all of these factors, staff is recommending that the board adopt a support position. So on here, it says support if amended, but again, because of the removal of the multifamily, we're just recommending a full support position on this bill. And that concludes my remarks. I'd be happy to take any questions that the committee might have.
Thank you, Matt. Are there any questions?
I have one. Did you say you
Don.
recommend a full support position now, not support if amended?
Correct.
Madam Chair, I think we should, the committee should recommend that.
Okay, thank you, Director. I know there was a lot of discussion at Met about this issue, and your representative, I believe, we were part of the discussion. But I concur. So we're moving forward. Unless Director Williams, do you have any comments or any questions?
Well, I think it's a wise decision. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you, Matt. The next item.
Yes, Madam Chair. The next item that we have is on 5P. It's related to Senate Bill 1430 by Senator Loomis. This bill is related to water systems and PFAS liability protection.
Thank you, EJ. So I am now on page 29 of the agenda packet. And before I get into my presentation, I did just want to let the committee know that someone from our Water Quality and Environmental Compliance Division is joining us here today. Jamie Burkhart is a Water Quality and Environmental Compliance Analyst too, and she and her team regularly tracks PFAS issues on behalf of West Basin. So Jamie here, if you have any more technical, actually we have both Jamie Malpete as well. So we have two folks from our water quality team. So if you have any more technical questions about PFAS and how it impacts or potentially impacts West Basin and our operations, Jamie and Jamie will be able to help address those questions. So again, for this item, staff is recommending the board adopt a support position on Senate Bill 1430, which is also known as the Water Systems PFAS Liability Protection Act. As you know, PFAS, also called the forever chemicals for their inability to kind of break down over time. This is an issue that affects all of us, both at a personal level from a health perspective, but also at a more macro level from a water industry perspective. And while we're somewhat fortunate to not be quite as impacted by PFAS in our service area as some of the other areas in Southern California, we are still the downstream recipients of PFAS. And so we want to make sure that, one, we're able to treat and dispose of it properly, but also to ensure that we're not held liable for the PFAS that comes into our system from other kind of producers of PFAS. And so one of the reasons that this is becoming more urgent is that the US EPA has recently proposed to designate PFAS as a hazardous substance under what's called the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, which is also known as Superfund. You may have heard of that before. So a Superfund designation for PFAS would authorize the government to require parties responsible for PFAS contamination to clean up or to fund the cleanup of these hazardous waste sites. This is what's commonly known as the polluter pays principle. So as a public water supplier, it's important to West Basin that we and other water agencies that had no part in creating PFAS, that we shouldn't be held liable for the cleanup costs associated with it. And so while legislators have talked about providing exemptions to water agencies in general, we need to make sure that recycled water production facilities are included in the list of exempted entities, as we wouldn't want to kind of find ourselves in a situation where wastewater treatment facilities such as Hyperion, the Hyperion plant, would be exempted, but then that same exemption wouldn't carry forward to recycled water facilities such as ECL. So last month, Senator Cynthia Lummis from Wyoming introduced a set of 5 bills that would ensure that utilities and municipalities are not subject to Superfund liability claims if PFAS is ultimately declared a hazardous substance, which it really looks like that's going to happen. And so one of the bills was S 1430, which proposes to shield drinking and wastewater operators from Superfund liability. As written in the bill, one of the exemptions would apply to special districts of a state that are acting as a wholesale water agency. So it seems to us that this would apply to West Basin, although we do want to make sure if this bill or a similar one moves forward, that it applies to both drinking water and recycled water supplies, as it impacts us at our ECL facility. The legislation is supported by a coalition of water industry organizations that includes AWWA, Water Reuse, the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies, the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, and the Water Environment Federation. I've been told by our federal advocacy team that another similar bill may be introduced later this year that may have more bipartisan support. But for the time being, this is an opportunity for us to kind of stake claim to support this bill while we continue to track other legislative vehicles that might come forward in the future. Again, as a passive receiver of PFAS, West Basin could be at risk of liability once it's designated as a hazardous substance. And so this bill would help shield us and our ratepayers from that liability and would help ensure that the polluters bear the cost burden. And so for these reasons, staff recommends the board adopt a support position on S 1430, the Water Systems PFAS Liability Protection Act. And that concludes my report. Please let myself or either of the Jamies know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. Any questions? Director Deere or Williams?
No questions, thank you.
No questions, Matt. Do you concur to moving forward, Director Deere?
Yes, I agree.
Yes. Thank you. We'll move it forward with your recommendation. Next item, please.
Madam Chair, the next item that we have is item 5C. This is related to the Support to Rehydrate the Environment, Agriculture, and Municipalities Act. It's the STREAM Act, and this is something that we've handled before. And for this presentation, we have Matt Bay, again, our Manager of Water Policy and Resources Development.
Thank you, EJ. I'm now on page 39 of the agenda packet. For this item, staff is recommending the board adopt a support position on the STREAM Act. Last year, Senator Dianne Feinstein and both Arizona senators introduced legislation As EJ mentions, it's titled the Support to Rehydrate Environment, Agriculture, and Municipalities Act. That bill did not end up making much headway in Congress by the end of the session, so Senator Feinstein is reintroducing the STREAM Act this year. The reintroduced bill includes most, if not all, of the same provisions as the first version. So just to briefly remind you that what it would do, the legislation would reauthorize several Bureau of Reclamation Western Water programs under the 2016 WIN Act that expired in December 2021. It would also provide the following funding levels, which are primarily carryovers from the previous version of the STREAM Act. So 300 million for water recycling, 150 million for desalination, 750 million for surface and groundwater storage and conveyance, 100 million for drinking water projects in disadvantaged communities, and 250 million for environmental restoration projects. In addition to the funding provisions, the new version of the bill again includes other proposals that would result in accelerated timelines for the approval and construction of future infrastructure projects. The Department of the Interior will be authorized to approve smaller water supply projects with lower funding requirements rather than having those go through congressional approval. In addition, it would reduce the timeline that Congress has to consider and take action on some of those storage projects that do rely on their approval. The West Basin Board of Directors did take a support position on the previous version of the STREAM Act. I also wanted to note that Metropolitan Water District has already adopted a support position on this updated version of the bill. And since this reintroduced version of the STREAM Act is largely the same as last year's and contains many provisions that would significantly benefit infrastructure and storage projects throughout the country and in California, staff is once again recommending the board adopt a support position on the STREAM Act. And that concludes my report. Please let me know if you have any questions.
I
Are
think
there
we
any
should,
questions, Director Dare?
no, I just feel we should support it. Pass it on through to the board.
Any questions, Director Williams?
No, thank you.
Okay, we're moving forward with the recommendation. Thank you. Okay, can we go to the next item on the agenda, please, TJ?
Yes, Madam Chair. Item 5D is related to our 2023 annual water supply and demand assessment. This is required by state law and is brought to you for your review and approval. For this presentation, we have Matt Bay, again, our Manager of Water Policy and Resource Development. And we also have Spencer Waterman from Water Systems Consulting.
Is Spencer on the call? Just want to make sure.
Yep.
He's on. Okay, all right. Hi,
Hey,
Spencer.
buddy.
Thanks for joining us. So Spencer and I have been working closely together on this effort for the past couple of months. So I'll go ahead and provide an overview of the process, and then I'll turn it over to Spencer for some of the more technical aspects of the project. And please feel free to stop us at any time during the presentation if you do have questions. Ultimately, our goal here is to have this committee and the full board give us the green light to submit the annual shortage report, which is required by the July 1st statutory deadline. So I'll now move into the first slide of the presentation, which is on page 76 of the packet. Okay, so just to give you an overview of this process and what this is. So in 2018, the Water Conservation as a California Way of Life legislation package was enacted, and it implemented new requirements to conduct an annual water supply and demand assessment for water agencies in California. So urban water suppliers, including wholesalers and retailers, are now required to conduct an annual assessment and to submit an annual shortage report to DWR by July 1st of each year. So what's kind of the purpose of it? So it asks you to really look at two key things. So number one is, does a shortage condition exist in the following year? And once that's been determined, if so, if there is a shortage, then what actions will the water supplier take to address that shortage? And so for us here at West Basin, which we'll kind of get into, we do expect to be reliable next year. We have reliability through the Metropolitan Water District, but then in addition, we have all of the kind of ongoing outreach and education, water conservation programs, We're currently at a level 3 shortage of our water shortage contingency plan. Those things help to reduce our demand down from what's considered unconstrained demand, which Spencer will talk a little bit about that. But the short of it is that we're very reliable, and that's what we're kind of saying with the report that we would propose to submit to the state this year. So our water shortage contingency plan does specify annual procedures for conducting this assessment. This is part of that, bringing it to this committee, tracking, water conditions throughout the year, working with Metropolitan to see what their annual assessment looks like. And then we're at the point now of the process where we're looking for committee and board, as well as customer agency feedback that will help inform the final version of the report that we submit. Moving to the next slide, just to give you an idea of what our coordination efforts have been. So on May 3rd, Metropolitan Water District held its really first and only annual assessment planning meeting. It was a very quick meeting, and that's because the message was very clear. And that's that Metropolitan does expect to meet all of their member agency imported water demands for the next year. This meeting was attended by myself and then also Spencer as well. And then on May 12th, Spencer and I both attended another meeting from the Department of Water Resources, who had an informational planning webinar where they talked about some of the updates to the process and to the system. Nothing major this year, pretty straightforward, but we did participate that as well. And then last week on June 7th, Metropolitan asked us to submit our draft annual assessment to them for their consideration and inclusion in their final report, which we did that. And then earlier this week, we did send out our draft assessment and tables to our customer agencies. And so we haven't heard any feedback from them as of yet, but if we do, that could be reflected in the final version of our report. But I think the fact that we're saying you're going to be reliable, we're going to be reliable this year to meet all your demands, there's really not much for them to come back to. And now I'm going to turn it over for the next several slides to Spencer, who conducted the assessment.
Great. Thanks, Matt. As mentioned in some of the previous slides, the annual assessment needs to project supply and demand for the coming fiscal year, and those need to be included into the Department of Water Resources required tables, which we'll show in the next few slides. In order to project supply and demand, we looked at historical trends. We also looked at the projections from the Urban Water Management Plan, and we also looked at the fiscal year budget projections. And ultimately, it was determined that the budget projections appear to be the most reasonable estimate. And those projections, in those projections, we expect imported retail to reduce by about 10% from the historical averages, and replenishment imported water to reflect about the same as the historic average. And I just want to point out, as you can see in the bottom chart, there was a higher than normal demand in fiscal year 21-22 for imported replenishment water, and that was due to the Hyperion facility shutdown. However, we expect to return to historic levels, which I'll discuss in the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so for recycled water, we followed the same method used for imported water projections, and ultimately we aligned with the budget projections, which show an expected 4% increase from historical average for retail recycled water, and about the same as historic use for replenishment water. I just also wanted to note that while we didn't use the Urban Water Management Plan projections, these projections do align with the general trend expectation that anticipates more recycled water use and less imported water use in the future. Next slide, please. All right, so the demand projections that were discussed in the previous slides were imported into DWR's required tables, a couple of which are shown here. In the top table 2, we did adjust the demands from the previous slides, and we did that in order to reflect what DWR wants to see for what they call unconstrained demand, which reflects demands as if any conservation or shortage level were absent. And this is a theoretical exercise, and it reflects the estimated impact of ongoing conservation from shortage level 3. If it weren't in effect, we'd expect about a 10% rebound or increase in demand, which is reflected in this table 2. For table 3, we do not expect any changes to the recycled water demand or supply due to unconstrained demand. Next slide, please. These DWR tables pull in the information from the previous ones and compare supply and demand. And initially, they show unconstrained demand that is theoretically inflated in the orange cells. And that would be kind of similar to a rebound roughly around the demands experienced in 2018. But then we show expected demands that will be reduced due to ongoing conservation. And those are shown in the yellow cells. The demand reduction is due to shortage level 3 being in effect and the shortage level response actions, which I will discuss in the next slide. Okay, so this last DWR table shows the shortage response actions, which are essentially conservation measures for all stages leading up to and also including levels 2 and 3. It is important to note that while the level 2 and 3 actions are implemented, they are not expected to result in drastic conservation beyond 10%. And that's because 2 of those actions require aligning with Metropolitan's water supply allocation plan and also enacting the district's drought rationing plan. And both of those are not currently in effect based on input that we've received from Metropolitan. Therefore, as we discussed in the previous slide, we expect that supply will meet demand, but demand is not anticipated to rebound to historical highs similar to those experienced in 2018. And that's due to the ongoing conservation and shortage response actions implementation. With that, I'll turn it back over to Matt to go over the next steps.
Great. Thank you, Spencer. So just to wrap up here, looking at the next steps. So the first step where we are right now is to answer any questions that this committee might have, to receive any feedback that you might have. We're also waiting to hear back from any of our customer agencies that we sent the draft tables and report out to earlier this week. And then if we receive any feedback where we need to possibly adjust something, we would consider that and include that as part of the final version of our report. And then board adoption would occur at the June 26th regular board meeting. We are including it as an action item. And once we receive that, we would then plan to submit the final version of the annual shortage report to DWR by the July 1st, 2023 deadline. So again, I want to thank Spencer for being here today, and please let us know if you have any questions for either Spencer or myself.
Thank you, Matt and Spencer. Are there any questions directed to Eric Williams?
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Matt, you mentioned that you're waiting for feedback, or Spence mentioned it, in terms of member agencies. So you'll have that information before the board meeting, so that when it comes to the board, you'll have a full report. Is that right?
That's correct. If there's any feedback that we do receive, we'll be sure to bring that to the board's attention at the regular board meeting.
Okay, and do you anticipate any feedback from member agencies because of the issue? Don't you think that they will be responding?
I don't anticipate any feedback. We didn't receive much last year, other than maybe 1 or 2 comments. And so I wouldn't expect much, but it's still possible something comes in.
Okay, thank you. Okay, all right, then we can move to the next item then. Thank you.
Yes,
Okay, then
Madam Chair.
item-
Yes, that concludes our action calendar and takes us to the information calendar. And the first item there is item 6A. It's a report on our integrated regional water management implementation grant program for Proposition 1, Round 2. And for this presentation, we have Tammy Hurley-High, our Water Policy and Resources Analyst 2.
Thank you, Jay. Good afternoon, directors, or good morning, I should say. I'm sorry, I'm already in the afternoon. So good morning. So this item is being brought to you today to provide an update on the grant proposal that was submitted in February to the California Department of Water Resources. And this was to seek funding under Proposition 1, Round 2, as EJ had mentioned, through DWR's Integrated Regional Water Management Implementation Process. And so the Greater Los Angeles Integrated Regional Water Management Group submitted that application on February 1st to request funding for 17 projects. And that application totaled just a little over $20 million. And so included in this report under attachment A is a list of projects that DWR has recommended funding for, just for your reference. So you can see all the other projects in the local area that has also received a recommendation. So West Basin has 2 projects that will receive grant funding as a result of this process. And these include new recycled water laterals in the cities of Carson and Gardena, along with a new conservation program in partnership with agencies in the North Santa Monica Bay area. So first I'll describe a little bit about the Harbor South Bay Water Recycling Plant or project, excuse me. So DWR is recommending $1.3 million to help fund this project. And West Basin would be able to expand its recycled water infrastructure with construction of new pipelines to public schools and parks located in the cities of Carson and Gardena. The Carson lateral would provide 35 acre-feet a year of recycled water for irrigation to Curtis Middle School and to Mills Park. And the North Gardena lateral would provide 24 acre-feet of recycled water for irrigation to Cary Middle School and Mas Bukai Park. This state funding would help to offset the project cost and leverage the federal funding of the $3.8 million that have already been secured by the Army Corps of Engineers. The second project is titled the Drought Resiliency Water Conservation Landscape Project. And for this, a total of $630,000 has been recommended for funding award. And this is a new partnership program with the Las Virgenes Municipal Water District and Los Angeles County Water Works District 29. And this joint project would provide conservation devices and incentives, also landscape design assistance, native plants, smart outdoor irrigation devices, grass replacement rebates, rain barrels, cistern, and fire escaping classes. So just to talk a little bit about the local cost share. For the Harbor South Bay project, it qualified to have the entire local cost share waived. And this project would provide direct water-related benefit to economically distressed and disadvantaged areas of Carson and Gardena. And for the Drought Resiliency Water Conservation Landscape Partnership Project, West Basin will be able to leverage the rebate fundings that are already provided by Metropolitan and contribute administration costs as this local cost share. So there will be no additional funding needed from West Basin for these programs. And the grant application fees, regarding the cost on that, the Harbor South Bay Water Recycling Project application fee is a total of $4,784.50. And the Drought Resiliency Water Conservation Landscape Project's application fee is $1,575.22. So that funding is available in this current fiscal year water policy budget. So as we are we're obligated to pay the share of the application fees that were submitted. So that concludes my report. I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Just a quick question concerning the Carson project. As it relates to the funding, the, you know, we had a little gap in the funding. Now, is that gap closed now?
It is not. So we do have that U.S. Army Corps funding. Staff has met with the U.S. Army Corps to move forward on the agreement. We need to execute that agreement. In hopes of closing that full gap, we went to Integrated Regional Water Management. We made several presentations as far as these two projects go to acquire as much funding as possible. Ultimately, for the two projects, we were awarded 1.3 million. So it's important to note that the funding gap is in totalities for those two projects. And though we could potentially find some smaller source of funding, we have asked the city of Carson, the city of Gardena, as well as the individual retailers, including Cal Water and Golden State. It doesn't look like there's any additional funds, but we're pretty close to fully funded. There is a small gap. It's important to note again that these two projects are in our disadvantaged communities. We have expanded programs and projects throughout our service area whenever possible. And so staff's recommendation would be to move forward despite that small funding gap, because we do have those significant outside sources of funds.
You would think that with all of the activity going on in the professional sports arena, that we should be able to get some kind of contribution from there with the help of the cities, recognizing that we as West Basin can't, but the cities should be able to put a little pressure on these professional organizations to pony up with that little, for them, this is a small little gap, right? Based on the amount of money that they make, that maybe we could get our incoming share of the South Bay COG to help us in that.
We're happy to turn over every rock, that's available and look for funding. We'll continue to do that. And just to put it, or to compare it a little bit, at E&O committee next week, you'll hear a little bit about an expansion project that we have one on the state of El Segundo to serve recycled water to the Chargers facility, their practice facility. And that is going to be fully funded by an outside source. So we're good there. These two projects, as Tammy mentioned, are to parks and schools. And so it's important that we work with our municipalities and school districts to ensure not just the water reliability, but of course, provide
Water conservation.
green spaces. So sometimes in those projects, there's a little bit less of a kind of investment as far as the outside business community, but we'll continue to work on it. If we can close that funding gap, we will.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
Nope.
Okay, thank you, EJ. Thank you, Tammy. Next item.
Yes, Madam Chair. The next item, I know we've already handled several legislative items, but we do have our regular monthly legislative update for the month of May 2023. And so for this presentation, we have Matt Bay.
Thank you, EJ.
Thank you.
So the legislative update begins on page 91 of the agenda packet with the state update, which is where I'll start on page 93. And then there's also an updated bill report that can be found starting on page 96. So we've reached the halfway point of this legislative year, with June 2nd marking the House of Origin deadline, whereby the bills must have passed out of the houses where they were introduced. The legislature is now back into kind of policy committee mode for those bills that did make it out of their original houses. And so they've got about another month of work ahead of them before they go into their summer break. The legislature is also beginning to hold hearings on the governor's proposed infrastructure package, which would help in part to streamline some of the processes around permitting and the approving of infrastructure projects in the state. Now, these are policy-driven actions, but they are being handled through budget trailer bills. This is a pretty common but sometimes controversial legislative tactic for getting things adopted, again, at a policy level without going through that traditional policy committee process. There's a number of trailer bills that have been proposed by the governor that are supported by Water Industry Coalition members such as Aqua. Also, today is the constitutional deadline for the legislature to pass next year's budget. I did not see yet whether they have actually done so. They do have until the end of the day. Sometimes it stretches into the late hours of the evening, but I would expect them to do that today pretty soon. The most recent version of the draft budget went into print a few days ago, and going into this week, it appeared that there's an agreement between the Senate and Assembly leaders to pass the budget by today. With projected revenue shortfalls continuing to grow for the past few months, the state's now expecting nearly a $32 billion deficit for the coming year. In addition, the governor continues to make his climate agenda a priority. However, as a result of the projected deficit, the governor has shifted some of the general fund dollars that were initially targeted for climate resilience programs into other programs in the state. And so instead, he's engaging with the legislature to pursue a climate bond that would go before voters next year. And last month, we had the board adopted a support position on a couple of those climate bond proposals. I also wanted to mention that there will be somewhat of a transfer of power occurring on July 1st when long-serving Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon hands over the speakership to Assemblymember Robert Rivas. This has been in the works for quite some time, the last year or two, and Rivas is currently putting together his team to make it a seamless transition. And then just a few updates on some of the priority bills that West Basin is tracking. SB 366, which would update the California Water Plan with long-term water supply targets, and which has a support position from this board. That one did pass out of the Senate, and it's currently referred to the Assembly Water Parks and Wildlife Committee with an expected hearing date on July 11th. SB 867 and Assembly Bill 1567 are the primary climate bond proposals that I just mentioned that the board also adopted a support and seek amendments position on last month. Staff is currently working with our Sacramento team and Water Industry Coalition members such as Aqua, Water Reuse, and CMUA to lobby for additional water funding levels in the bond. Staff has also drafted a support letter that will be shared with our delegation and other relevant stakeholders to push for those higher funding amounts. AB 1216 is the bill by Assemblymember Muratsuchi, which would require air quality monitoring at the Hyperion plant. It did pass the Assembly last month and is now referred to the Senate Environmental Quality Committee. And then in addition, while a half dozen or so controversial water rights bills were introduced this year, there's a trio of them that are still alive after making their way through the House of Origin. And while we don't have any positions on these bills, we do continue to engage with Aqua, Metropolitan, and others to track and evaluate the impacts of those proposals. And that concludes my state report. I'd be happy to take any questions on that before I move over to the federal update.
Any questions?
Done.
All right, Matt, I think you can move on.
Okay, all right. I'll just wrap it up here. So I'm now on page 117 of the agenda packet. And the biggest news coming out of Washington, D.C. happened late last month when Congress came to an agreement to raise the country's debt limit in order to hold off a government shutdown from occurring. The bill was passed by the House, followed by the Senate, and then finally signed into law by President Biden on June 3rd. On May 31st, Senator Alex Padilla held a subcommittee hearing on water affordability. The hearing was titled Water Affordability and Small Water Systems Assistance. During the hearing, the group heard about how aging infrastructure, rising water rates, and natural disasters are hurting water affordability throughout the country. Senator Padilla highlighted the affordability issues being faced by our disadvantaged communities, which often lack the staffing and the finances to make upgrades to failed or failing infrastructure. He also spoke about the need to make the EPA's low-income household water assistance program a permanent program, elevating it from its current pilot project status. And finally, I know that Tammy will cover the most recent Colorado River news as part of her Metropolitan update, but I will just mention briefly that on May 22nd, the three lower basin states of California, Arizona, and Nevada announced a consensus-based proposal for conserving up to 3 million acre feet of Colorado River water through 2026. It really marks a breakthrough for the ongoing negotiations surrounding the river, which is a win for California and the other basin states. Other federal issue updates can be found in the BSA monthly report, and that concludes my federal update.
And thank you. Are there any questions?
No,
Well, thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you again. I believe the last item is closed session. And that's all.
Actually, Madam Chair,
Yeah,
Madam Chair, there's one more item under our information calendar. It's our monthly Metropolitan Water District update.
oh,
And for that
Okay,
presentation, we have Tammy Hurley.
okay, great.
Thank you. All right, so I will provide program updates on a few programs that are of interest to West Basin and wrap up with a brief summary on the water supply condition. And this information begins on page 121 of the committee packet. So the first item is a brief update on the Bay Delta Island activities. The Metropolitan Board had adopted a resolution to support a $20 million grant application to the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy. And this would be to develop a multi-benefit landscape on the Webb Tract Island. And so recently, the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy Board did approve the grant application. And this will help fund the project, a mosaic landscape wetland project on Webb Tract Island. And it will improve community access and support climate resiliency. These activities will be designed to stop and reverse subsidence, generate carbon credits from carbon sequestration opportunities, and create more habitat. The grant funding for this project was made possible by the Amended Budget Act of 2022, which provides the Delta Conservancy with general fund for projects that support nature-based solutions and wetland restoration. The next item I'll talk about is the Climate Adaptation Master Plan for Water. So since earlier this year in February, Metropolitan staff has been working with their board and member agencies in developing a Climate Adaptation Master Plan for Water. And this is being developed in a collaborative effort in order to better integrate metropolitan planning for water resources, climate resilience, and finances, given the significance of rapidly increasing impacts of climate change on water supplies and operation. West Basin staff, we have been very actively tracking and participating where possible in these climate issue discussions. And last month, there was a focus on a mutual understanding of how Metropolitan defines terminology that includes resilience, reliability, affordability, and financial sustainability. So this planning effort for the Climate Adaptation Master Plan for Water will continue in June, as Metropolitan will hold another board workshop, and that will be scheduled for Tuesday, June 27th. Those discussions will be centered on member agencies' needs assessments, the water supply gap analysis, and planning alignment of member agencies and Metropolitan. And so the next item is a quarterly financial review. Just wanted to give you a quick update that Metropolitan staff did prepare a report for the Finance Committee on their third quarterly review. And overall, it was reported that year-to-date water transactions are below budget by about 7%. And for untreated water, it's below budget by 9%. Earlier in this fiscal year, from July through December 2022, water transactions were aligned with the budget forecast. However, since January, there has been a reduction in the water demand. So these results are primarily due to the record rainfall that we had earlier this year, and also continued conservation efforts. And through the remainder of this fiscal year, Metropolitan is projecting water transactions to continue under budget by approximately 13%. And year-to-date revenues are currently projected to be 10% less than budget, while expenses are projected to exceed the budget by about 1%. Overall, they are projecting an operating deficit and they're planning to use approximately $129 million in their unrestricted reserve balance to manage these budget variances. And these funds would be utilized from their water rate stabilization fund. The next item I'll cover is the Colorado River operations. So as you recall, in April, Reclamation announced the release of the draft supplemental environmental impact statement to amend the 2007 interim Colorado River guidelines. So this draft would, it included 2 action alternatives along with a no action alternative that would reduce water deliveries in order to protect critical infrastructure on Lakes Powell and Meade. And the public comment period concluded on May 2nd. The Metropolitan has been closely working with Lower Basin State to develop a unified comment letter, which was submitted to Reclamation with an outline to conserve an additional 3 million acre feet of Colorado River water through December 2026, which is when the current operating guidelines are set to expire. And the Basin States supported this proposal, or this proposed plan, because it demonstrates a more equitable approach in managing supplies from the Colorado River. And the Basin States had requested that the proposal be fully analyzed as an action alternative in addition to the existing 2 alternatives that are listed under the supplemental EIS. So as a result, Reclamation paused the supplemental environmental process and suspended the comment period in order to analyze a Lower Basin proposal. Reclamation will publish an updated draft supplemental environmental impact report for public comment, and Metropolitan continues to work closely with the other parties of the Lower Basin State to developing implementing agreements for the near future. So overall, this has been a collaborative effort, a very collaborative effort among the Lower Basin entities. So then I'll just mention a few attachments included in this report that include the results of the May committees and board during May, and a summary of the board member votes for May. And then attachment C includes the item for the June meetings. And then I'll touch a little bit about on the water supply update. So if we can look at that water supply update chart that begins on page 134 of the committee packet. And just as you recall, DWR did increase the table A allocation to their contractors to 100% allocation in April. And this is the first time the State Water Project has had a 100% allocation since 2006. So with this final allocation increase, Metropolitan can now receive more than 2 million acre feet through the State Water Project system. Now, since December, Metropolitan operations have shifted from a large surplus. And Metropolitan is now focused on storing as much water as possible. So on the chart for the State Water Project green shaded area on the left side, the San Luis Reservoir is at capacity. Lake Oroville is also reached capacity just recently this month on June 6th. And the Department of Water Resources has been releasing water since March, utilizing the main spillway so they can do their flood control operations. And so since December 1st, Lake Oroville storage has increased more than 240 feet and has gained over 2.5 million acre feet of water. So for the Colorado River Basin, on the right side of the page, this graph shows Lake Powell to be at 26% capacity and Lake Meade at 30% capacity. And then if we move to the next page, the second page, shows the storage reserve in major watersheds in California and Colorado. On the left side, the green shaded area for the State Water Project, the Northern Sierra snowpack peaked at 59.1 inches and is now at 199% of normal. The Acacia Precipitation Index is showing 62.7 inches or 126% of normal as of May 14th. And on the Colorado River side, the upper Colorado River Basin accumulated precipitation is 25.9 inches or 123% of normal. And the upper Colorado River snow water equivalent, that peaked at 26.2 inches and is at 165% of normal. So down below on this graph towards the bottom of the chart, it shows a table for Lake Mead, a Lake Mead surplus shortage outlook. And this depicts the probability of a shortage declaration. As you are aware, Reclamation declared a shortage at Lake Mead. And currently the lower basin is at a level A2A shortage for this calendar year 2023. Under this level, Metropolitan is not impacted. Reclamation will release the 24-month study in August. And if that study projects that Lake Mead operationally neutral elevation is at or below 1,045 feet on January 1st, 2024, then Metropolitan would be required to make drought contingency plan contributions that would take effect in calendar year 2024. So currently there is a 93% chance of shortage continuing in calendar year 2024. And there's a 3% chance that Metropolitan will see a reduction in Colorado River supplies in calendar year by 180,000 acre feet. So in the short term for 2023, Metropolitan is projecting to have record storage levels as supplies are exceeding demand. And this is a result of significant number of cold, wet winter storm conditions. However, there is a lot of uncertainty that remains as a large amount of the supplies are stored in Lake Mead under their ICS account. So that concludes my summary on Metropolitan activities. And thank you for the opportunity, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
All right, thank you, Tammy. Any questions? All right, thank you for that report. Well, I think that's the last item, so we'll go to closed session. Is there any closed session?
Madam Chair, we have no closed session items for today.
All right, then the next item is Director's comments. Director Deere?
Sure, a good committee report. Everything was very understandable, and it was only for an hour. I think it's excellent.
Thank you. Director Williams?
No, thank you.
All right. I concur. Staff always give very thorough reports. So thank you to everyone who presented this morning, and thank you, EJ and board members. And so with that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, members of the committee and board and staff.